You're welcome to time yourselves. I'll try to put like the protected time limits in the chat, but the probability I forget at least one of the 8 times is approaching 1. So don't take that as gospel. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. For POIs in the chat, please, or if I don't answer you at some point, then you can just unmute yourselves and shout at me. That works too. Panel, when people see the destruction of the climate, on our side of the house, they recognize that it is their duty to go out on the streets and protest because there are people being affected disproportionately and there needs to be a certain degree of change. On our side of the house, when you go into a restaurant, you're not seeing yourself in the restaurant, like your situation, as your right to be served at the table, but instead your duty to be nice to people and the waiters there. At the end of the day, we think the world in which people live in on our side of the house, at the point in which they see the moral obligation of their actions as a duty that rather than right, is better. 2 pieces of framing before one big argument about how the world is better off on our side, vis-a-vis people are better, they create better moral actions, and we think that's a good thing. 1, how does this moral framework actually look like? That is to say, how does it affect people? We think this works in 2 ways. 1, people are socialized to be more proactive. They're socialized to not see, like, if there's a choice of actions that allows you to do one thing that is beneficial, not doing anything would be seen as a bad action. That is to say, you're more likely to be proactive in society because doing nothing is not good enough, even if it is your right to do nothing. On our side of the house, it was seen as a duty that you must do something because negligence is culpable. This works in 2 ways. 1, people would be socialized in a world in which this is a norm. But 2, considering it's a prefers motion, we think that we have a certain degree of fiat that people believe this either way. So we think that people are socialized, people believe in a world in which being proactive is something that is necessarily good. Secondly, in terms of how this can result in oppression, this is probably preempting opposition, we think it's likely to be symmetrical insofar as the justifications for oppression are used on either side of the house. That is to say, something is a right or something is a duty. Well, at the point at which it serves self-serving interests of people at the top work either way, we think that this policy rather affects people on a more superficial level. That is to say, if you have a certain action between being nice to someone or not being nice to someone, you will be nice to them because your moral responsibility says that it is your proactive decision to be nice to someone or give them some sort of money if they're begging for it in charity, etc., etc. Thus, we think that this affects more on how you lead your life as an individual rather than the structural oppression of society. Before I get into my arguments, I'll take closing if they have anything. Otherwise, I'll take opening. Closing?
The white man's burden says that colonizers had a duty to bring like modernization to the rest of the world.
Yes, and on your side of the house, it is their right to colonize people. Like, it would probably happen on either side of the house. The marginal difference isn't that high. I would say it's more likely to be superficial things that are like individual choices of how you want to live your life. We think generally people on our side of the house are going to be more proactive. People on our side of the house are going to be more altruistic rather than just seeing it as their deserving right to get certain things. What are the impacts of people being more like less negligent and more likely to go out and do things in society? 1, people are more likely to give to charity, especially rich people. At the point at which you see your excess wealth, you're likely to see it as your moral obligation to do good in the world, and thus doing nothing is like negligence is also morally culpable on our side of the house. Thus, it's more likely that you are going to do things like give to charity. You are going to do things like give money to homeless people, and we think this is obviously a good thing, not only for individuals who are on the ground, but also on a more societal basis. It allows more people to be able to be lifted from poverty and things like that. Secondly, on just an everyday superficial basis, you're likely to be kinder to people. And we think that at the point at which you go to a restaurant and you're likely to be kind to the waitresses and the waiters, insofar as there's someone who you should be kind to because it is your moral obligation to do so, these people are more likely to be happy. We think that is a priori a good thing at the point at which people are more content with their day and the lives that they're living. Recognize that the people who you're often mean to are those that already have pretty shitty jobs and pretty shitty lives. We think that those are the precise people that you should be nice to. You should have some sort of degree of kindness, not just demand your rights that you have in a restaurant or at a cafe. Thirdly, we think it's more likely that on our side of the house, you have a greater degree of social welfare. The reason for this is at the point at which you have a moral obligation to help other people in society because negligence is culpable, we think that you're more likely to go to the government and be like, look, you have this much money that you're getting from taxes. Why don't you put it into education? Why don't you put it into actually doing some sort of change that would be mutually beneficial for society? No, thank you. At the point in which that's true, we think it's better because more people are able to not only be lifted out of poverty, but have overall better lives at the point in which the government sees it as its obligation to do specific things. Fourthly, at the point at which like doing direct harm at the point in which you're not doing anything is frowned upon, keeping things such as money, keeping things such as resources that could be used to alleviate a certain degree of pain are seen as a bad thing. We think that like people at the top, at least to a certain degree, even if they aren't like MNCs, are likely to change certain things in the way that they live their lives. Even if it's just a small degree of change, we're willing to take that small degree of change insofar as it's likely to still be quite a bit more money, and that could change someone's life in the long run. Fifthly, you're more likely to have things such as political activism and climate change activism, which we think is a really good thing. You're more likely to go out and vote because it is not your right to vote, but it is your duty to vote. It is your duty to go out and make a change in the political system. And we think at the point at which that's true, you're more likely to educate yourself, you're more likely to do things that would actually result in positive changes for society. And recognize this isn't only like you per se, right? Because currently in the status quo, we see a lot of things such as voter apathy for climate change because it does not affect people directly. In fact, on our side of the house, we think that it is more likely that people see it as their obligation when they see other people harmed. For instance, people in coastal areas are harmed in the status quo due to climate change. We think people would see this and recognize their obligation to them as well as other human beings within society, and thus more likely to go out for political activism and climate change. They don't only care about their own rights and their self. We think this is really good. And sixthly, we think it's more likely on a global level to lead to things such as foreign aid and also things such as reparations for things that happened in the past. It is not your right anymore to just keep all the money that you have precisely because something happened in the past and now we're not part of that regime anymore. No, it is your obligation to give money back to the global south that has been systemically exploited for the last century. And thus we think it is better for these countries to be able to develop on our side. So at the end of this speech, what we've told you is that at the point in which you're passive, you're less likely to have all these things. And at the point in which even a marginal change in one of these things is extremely beneficial for people involved, even if it's just kindness or if it's monetary benefits, it's very, very much beneficial for the world as a whole for those many reasons, OG.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister and invite the Leader of Opposition.
Hello, can I be heard? Hello?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, lovely. I'll take POIs in chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is a debate with a great deal of convergence. So what we're going to do is first precisely frame what the marginal difference is. Firstly, illustrate why the kind of moral system you create is one that cares less about people that are vulnerable and cares more about the people who have the duty as opposed to those that they have a duty to. And then secondly, we will illustrate why people adhere less to moral systems in general, which presuming governments claim is a very bad thing. Firstly, so this debate is not about it being more proactive or not being more proactive. And I will illustrate why, even if it were, that means nothing to like people in society. The first is that people have a series of competing duties that they can pick and choose from. And so when government in general argues that the main marginal change comes from doing more and being more proactive, and then spamming outcomes like social welfare and foreign welfare, this presumes that they pick the right duties, when I think intuitively, if people have a series of duties they may seek to choose from, they will likely choose the thing that they have a stronger selfish reason to pick. That is, maybe they have a proximate duty to their family, maybe they have a proximate duty to, perhaps, maybe they have some arbitrary duty to care about people that may be experience some harm in some fashion, but they may feel that more proximately and more strongly to the family members who may be, they have an obligation to give money to, and for that to happen, they need to work in jobs that may be bad for the environment. So as it so happens, it's not clear to me that this leads to the outcomes that they're claiming already on a superficial level. But secondly, it's also not clear that being proactive is good. Some instances of proactivity being good and some instances of proactivity being bad may still happen. Like you may proactively try to help the poor, but since you're a Republican, often you may firmly believe that trickle-down economics is the best way to do this. So it's not actually clear that redistributing and all the good stuff that they want is how they do this. But similarly, if you're mean to someone, right, like it's not clear that this would stop happening, like because at some point, if you're infringing on their rights because you're mean to them, this seems like something that would equally be upheld on our side. So at this point, it's clear that Gov is somewhat of a wash. Then we're going to talk about the derivation of rights and actual moral system that comes about. Here, we'll talk about the main marginal difference in this debate. Moral systems are concerned about obligation, and we see that the main dispute in this debate is whether or not these obligations should be pursued because you believe that people have a minimum threshold of a right that should be preserved, or because you have a personal moral failing when you are not fulfilling your duty. What we say is that this change is one that leads to a primary emphasis on the person that does the giving instead of the person that does the receiving. Because in comparison, while rights can still establish some obligation, the perception is that the importance of doing that obligation is the violation of a right, which places central moral emphasis on the person that is on that is doing the harm. Which means that the person that is having the right has comparatively more power in the determination of both moral goodness and moral blameworthiness in this moral system that we are creating in some fashion. This may translate into a variety of ways, whether it be how likely we are to listen to victims speaking up because of the fact that they have the right to be heard, for example, or how likely we are to care about prisoners because they have the right to be protected and so on, because they have the right to be, to vote and all these things, right? So that's the first illustration that we just want to point out, that the likely change is whether or not we perceive rights to be derived from this thing or the other thing. And we think that the rights that you are likely to create, or the moral system that you're likely to create when you have it focused on the person that has a duty, is one that likely develops around things proximate to the person doing the giving, because they are the ones in control of which duties they feel like they should choose. So that means that they're substantially empowered to center around the concerns of those that have power. So you're likely to witness an over-prioritization of obligations that arise from reciprocal relationships, like your family members, like your ethnic group, and so on, which means that on a prima facie basis, right, like this means that the majority of people who don't have access to these support systems, the majority of people who live in some form of poverty, those who are substantially more vulnerable and would need access to this moral system more, are just likely to experience harm. Just to illustrate, this is a gigantic harm, but it's somewhat abstract. This means that you're likely to see perhaps an increase in racism because of the very basic belief that these people are less worthy of our care or our support, because not only are they less morally worthy because we're allowed to allocate duty away from them, they also don't have an independent reason we should care about them, and so on. You might see, for example, a decrease in many of the things that government points out as likely to happen, because maybe you have an obligation to stop climate change for where you live, but you don't really have an obligation to care about other people because of the fact that this duty does not extend to them, because the construction of that duty is unlikely to extend to them. As such, weighing wise, what happens? First, this argument concerns the development of moral systems and the kind of laws that arise, which means that any impact in this debate is hung on whether or not that moral system is good, and as such is immediately superseded by claims about how that moral system develops over time. And as we illustrate, the development of this moral system is one that is profoundly likely to center around the people who are mostly in positions of privilege and are mostly likely to be in power. Secondly, this illustrates the reason why we need to construct our moral systems around the people whom we are supposed to help. This is because we have systemic empathy gaps that make us incapable of estimating how much we are capable of actually helping people, because we are often distanced from their moral plights and it's unclear to us how much we should help them. And so we're systemically bad at estimating how much duty we should allocate for an individual person. The comparative creation of rights, while perhaps is imperfect, is substantially more centered on these people's claims and concerns towards some moral good. Thirdly, and lastly, is that this is a gigantic change. On a simple basic level of gravity and scale, these systems of morality have a large direct sway over how people internalize their happiness. A lot of political decisions are made as appeals to moral outrage, and moral systems underpin a lot of decisions that you make in your life. And as we basically make the observation, you have substantially more good allocated to the majority of people in the world that need it the most. I'll take a PY from CG.
Human nature also makes us more sympathetic to people who look like us, live close to us, etc. Therefore, more likely for us to only think that people who are around us have rights and deserve them.
Oh, so this actually gets comparatively fixed, which we will illustrate in the second argument. But this is a non-mutually exclusive thing. What we illustrate is that the construction of the moral system around that disempowers that specific thing, as opposed to the duty, which gives these people in positions of power more of a chance to pick. So secondly, you're also more likely to follow the moral systems. This argument presumes that if you don't care about the first one, and you just believe people care about the moral system on either side, and it's good on either side, then this debate is about where we should get people to adhere to that moral system. First, people are just not receptive to assertions of selfishness or assertions of duty for three reasons. One, One, people in general are very good at forgetting both obligations and the rights of others, and they need to feel very proximate to the harm, with many more indications of the cause of people's actions. As such, centering around the actual harm of that right being violated is substantially more persuasive to people. Secondly, upon feeling personal shame for not fulfilling a particular duty, people are more likely to express these feelings, or alternatively have a natural tendency to argue back, which means that people end up coming up with justifications for their behavior to justify them post hoc, which means that on comparison, right, even if you do create some form of moral outrage in many of these people, if it is constructed in the form of a duty, they're likely to just deconstruct that duty as opposed to try and attack everyone else in society that may have that right. But thirdly, lastly, is that you're also less likely to be capable of bridging that empathy gap. On our side, people are capable of feasibly conceiving how they would feel if their rights were violated, because it is constructed under some universal belief that these rights are stemming from something inalienable in people and something that people inherently deserve, and that you would be able, at the very least, of conceiving that you would feel bad yourself if this right was taken away from you, as opposed to you perceiving that something is being taken away from you directly because your duty is being given to someone else, and as such centered on yourself being in the position of losing something. So at the end of this speech, this debate is kind of complicated and hard to judge. I'm going to be the first debate to say this debate is not simple, but it's clear opening opposition has the most clear harm and the most compelling one. For these reasons, negate.
I thank the leader of opposition and invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Am I audible? Cool.
Yeah.
I would prefer POIs in the chat if that is possible. Thank you. Okay, first, let's do some negation. Opening opposition starts with saying that people have a duty, like the point at which you have a duty to people, you focus it more on the people, and this makes it less likely for individuals to uphold rights. Here's the comparison, though. At the point at which they talk about the comparative here is that at the point at which you have duties, you put the burden on individuals that they want to be good people to actually uphold these duties. And this is the exact same thing that Annika has been talking about. That is to say, just because you say that someone has certain rights, you don't link to the fact that I am the one that has to uphold these rights. That is to say, I'm pretty sure that even Republicans in America agree that Black people should not be facing this match of discrimination, but they also agree that the government shouldn't be the one that provides them the escape outside of the discrimination. That is to say, at the point in which we center the discussion and understanding of the morality at the point in which of duty, we are more likely to force individuals into actually combining these actions. That is to say, opposition uniquely justifies passivity at the point in which it gives the individuals the ability to say, okay, you have this right, but my ability for you to uphold these rights is not inherently linked to you. Comparatively, why is it more likely that these duties are likely to be upheld to different individuals? Well, just in general, because in fact, individuals do find themselves to be good people and understand just general morality. That is to say, at the point in which we already understand that Black people are just in general marginalized communities are in fact discriminated against, people will understand that this is some sort of their duty at the point in which they see that they have the ability to go against it. This is the same exact example of the point in which individuals work on a daily basis. If I see someone crying, I believe that they should have a right to be happy. The question is whether or not I have the duty to help this individual or not. I believe that this person should be happy. The question is whether or not I'm going to help them. On our side of the house, you have a duty. On their side of the house, you can excuse it on the same grounds. And recognize how this deals with literally the entirety of their argumentation. At the point in which they say that one people are more likely to center these moral centers around the individuals that have duties rather than other things. Yes, exactly. We're putting the burden on individuals that they should be actually doing something. At the point in which you're talking about how it's less likely. But let's deal with the second claim that just says that people are less likely to listen to moral systems. Clearly, their first claim about how people are not perceptive goes straight out of the box at the point in which people are likely to be socialized in this scenario. That is to say, people are not going to be this would clearly change the point in which people would understand that duties are something that they should be upheld and things like that. Similarly, when it comes to shame, this is clearly worse on their side of the house at the point in which rights are easier to argue away at the point in which you say, sure, you have this right, not my duty to uphold it. Now, let's go through these things. Before moving on, I will take a POI from closing.
Sure. If there's an active shooter, do I have a duty to put myself in front of his bullet?
Here's the thing. This is a question of the individual situation of this person being actually in that situation. Probably this person has the ability to decide on the other side of the house. The question is more on these like nuanced different situations. Probably a person has the duty to do it to certain degrees. I don't know. It's probably going to be based on this individual socialization and understanding. The question is whether or not like in different situations. Okay, now what is our main mechanism that we've been talking about? At the point at which an individual claims that that person is a good person and a person is an entity wants to be seen as a good entity, this happens only when you uphold these same duties. And similarly, like at the point at which opposition says that you have competing duties that are at the same time working together, panel recognize the competing duties are the exact same thing that we're talking about. We believe that a person is only able to say that they're a good person when they're upholding most or all of these duties, and simultaneously these people can only do that. What does this mean? This does in fact mean that people are going to be more active on our side of the house. This does mean that people are more likely to be good, nice to people, give to charity, pressure governments to be more social welfare, and the narrative of people having this duty to do certain things. And recognize how none of our impacts were actually dealt with, even though a lot of them were actually talking about how the narrative of having duties is the thing that pressures these individuals. That is to say, when we're talking about how we're pressuring rich people to give money to charity, we give impact on how much money is going to charity. When we're pressuring more social action and things like that, this is the way that we're going against it. And foreign aid is the exact same thing that can actually happen in these scenarios. When an entity has the incentive to look good, this happens on our side of the house. Why is this important in the general society of cases, in general situation of cases? That is to say, more good people just in general want to be seen as good people, and entities want to be seen as good entities. This means that the only way that they are likely to be wanting to be seen as upholding different duties, and this leads them to be actually good people. That is to say, on a comparison, they're only the ability for them to actually be seen as good people is to simply not do bad things. And this means that this is essentially more likely to go away with a lot of different things. Comparisons are like essentially on opposition, I'm more likely to be seen as a good person, even if I'm just simply not doing bad things. On our side of the house, you also have to have some certain duty in different situations. Lastly, let's deal with this notion that a lot of oppressive regimes are still able to like justify different things. Just as Aniket pointed out at the very beginning of his speech, he pointed out that a lot of oppressive regimes are probably going to happen on our side of the house. And there's oftentimes two levels of frameworks on morality. That is to say, the moral basis that we're talking about now, and also the oppressive regimes that necessitate some oppressions in certain situations. That is to say, this is probably pretty clear that there's always going to be some sort of patriarchy. There's always going to be some sort of oppression, and they're going to be justified on both sides of the house, something that opposition already concedes to. However, recognize that these duties are like, when they try to claim that these duties are more likely to be justified from perspectives of oppressors, I would argue that it's more likely on our side of the house that these duties are questioned. That is to say, I have a duty to a person around me, at the point at which I have a duty to, for example, my family, at the point at which I have a duty to be a good person to just in general people, I'm likely to I have a duty to also listen to the people in themselves. This is just like, just in general moral frameworks and things like that. And I would argue this is the extension that essentially there's these social abilities to argue against entities that have power, have more power, at the point at which it is already normalized to talk about what the duty of every institution is, and it's such a lot of like social like programs, activism is more likely to be effective at the point at which their narrative is more likely to force individuals to do certain things. This is essentially the extension. The comparison, again, here is on our side of the house, we force individuals to go do good things. On their side of the house, they're simply saying that you don't have to do bad things in order to be good. This is essentially an unjustified passivity that we're currently doing with society. Clearly important because this leads to people doing more good things, such as Aniket mentioned in his first speech. Never been prouder to propose.
All right, I think that speaker and invite the leader of opposition to close out the top half. A deputy leader of opposition, sorry.
All right. POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I would highly recommend that everyone read the riveting exchange I had with Hadar in the clarifications chat, because this suggests that rights can be obligations and vice versa. That is, on opening opposition, we point out, I think David does this, they just didn't listen to it, that if I have a right to have clean water, then this does incur an obligation on people for them to give me clean water as well. So the things that people believe they ought to do are largely symmetric under both sides of the house. The difference is, as David points out, when you think about obligations, you think particularly about what you're supposed to do. You think about the people you're closest to, then you feel shame, you feel, which is actually a premise of the OG case. By contrast, when we care much more about rights, when we try and emphasize the obligation to do something or the need to do something, we're far more likely to focus on the person that is affected, on how they live their life. That is the crucial distinction. This means that almost all of OG is immediately irrelevant because there's no a priori way for them to access the claims that now we're going to do things proactively, governments are going to give, etc. and etc. So for instance, like it's very easy, probably it is true that the Republicans have an obligation to care about other people, but they're still able to say things like, well, we have an obligation first to Americans and particularly to white Americans or working Americans. Their only remaining piece of material is as good when people feel shame. It would have been very nice if they had responded to David's point on this, because David points out that most of the time this actually disempowers people from helping because now they have an incentive to try and turn away or argue against the existence of that obligation, which is often the justification for trying to argue why people don't matter. That is, when Republicans try and say we don't need to do something, the thing they're required to do is to construct racist explanations, which probably exacerbates this political rhetoric, whereas when there's a focus on rights, there's far less likely to do this because people are not going to, feel as much shame, I guess. So opening up government is out of this debate. Closing government has an interesting POI, so I'm going to try and guess a government extension that they may or may not run. Like, I think reasonably the problem with rights is that it requires a minimum view of the other person mattering. You need to believe that they are a person, that they are special. Whereas this isn't necessarily true. I can feel like I have an obligation to just be a good person, independently of whether the other people have moral desert. I think that this ends up being largely symmetric to the extent that obviously people feel like they have some obligations. So if they don't believe that other people are sufficiently special, that they have very strong obligations or approximately similar obligations between the way they feel towards their family and the way they do towards people of different races, they will always end up prioritizing their family and behave as though those people had no rights in the first place. The difference that means we actually end up winning much quicker on this is that in the rate of progress of society, it will arrive at a far higher point that we think that people of different races, or for instance, women, are deserving of moral worth. Because when we focus on rights, we're far more likely to focus on the other person, to talk about them, to think about them. And this means it's far harder to deny that they are very, very similar to you, which means in the long run, I think all of David's analysis explains why the sphere of moral desert is likely to expand substantially faster under our side, which literally I think means centuries of abuse are likely to, go away because under our side, we are less likely to have racism occurring. I'll take a POI from closing if they have anything.
Yeah. So it could also be the case that in your world, even the dominant group doesn't believe itself has rights, or less vulnerable members of that group have rights, rather than extending rights universally on your side of the house.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think the same thing could be true about they could believe that they have obligations, but those obligations again could extend extremely minimally. For instance, your only obligation could be a devout Christian and not at all extend towards being kind towards other people or other human beings. So I think to a large extent this is symmetric, but our arguments suggest that given in general people like some kind of protections that either require people to be obliged towards them or just assert that they have rights, in the long run these things are likely to establish, and that rate is merely going to be faster under our side of the house. The final thing I want to do is just point out that I think this obligations chat is a pretext for violating other people's rights a large amount of the time. And I think this is very, very important because government has presumed that proactivity is a good thing because you will be helping other people. If this is a justification for oppression, then they just lose this round outright because the thing they are advocating for is bad. I've noticed that even if I don't prove this, given OG hasn't proved that helping is always good, and again, David points that out, we're still ahead of opening government. What does David say is unique to focus on obligations? Firstly, it is highly intellectual because it is focusing on yourself and what you're obliged to do rather than just observing the living conditions of other people. This means that your capacity to have it to be divorced from real life and to focus on things like your religion or other philosophical justifications what matter, or your own interests are substantially higher. The second thing is I think there's a far more focus on particular obligations. That is, I think when you think about rights, it is far more likely that there will just be some baseline view of everyone mattering. And that empirically is what happens in the rights literature, which means that by and large, the things that people deserve are relatively similar. By contrast, I think when people think about obligations, they think about themselves. They think, I am a Christian, and therefore my particular obligation is to act in Christian ways. This, to a large extent, allows them to divorce what they should do and what their moral obligations are from the actual people that they are supposed to be helping. How does this actually affect the round? The first thing to point out is, I think, yeah, as David points out, we just get a nice impact. Just people are much more likely to be selfish. They're much more likely to focus on their families, to think, these are the people that matter most to me. These are the people that give the most to me. I have the greatest obligation to help them out. By contrast, we're far more likely to have good giving under our side of the house. This means that all of the kind of nice social programs are far more likely to exist, and therefore we're doing well. But secondly, I think this means uniquely that they're able to justify a large amount of oppression under their side of the house. I want to notice that obligations, or like in general, that the going and helping other people has incurred very, very high costs on people. Maybe it's just giving up some amount of money is a thing which is pretty bad for people. Or things like the crusade, which is this great moral obligation. You would die, and even if you didn't die, you would bankrupt your country or maybe lose your husband, right? These are things that have very, very acute impacts for other people. I think, therefore, that sorry, 1 second. In general, it is unlikely that people would be engaging in this behavior absent a very, very strong fear created in them that they're going to be going to hell. What I think this looks like, I think the focus on obligations means particularly that you're able to tell people they are a bad person and therefore induce them to do all of these kinds of things. Why is this a bad thing? I think the first thing is that it just means that people have abnormal sacrifices that are just not morally justified. This, I think, looks like saying you have an obligation to your family for women that often is a thing which is used to pressure them into doing things they otherwise not want to, or joining the crusades, or in general engaging in this kind of religious warfare that's probably not merited in a view of rights, because it's, again, you need this focus on the self and then particularly feeling like they're going to go to hell otherwise. But secondly, I think people just face a large amount of existential angst, even in the event that you aren't able to persuade them to give up these kind of sacrifices. And I think people feeling like they're going to go to hell because there's so much talk about their obligations under Christianity or any other religion is a very bad thing, because in as much as religion matters to people, this substantially decreases their quality of life. I'd like to notice, I don't think this is a knife of David. This applies in the context where you do have institutions that are able to wield large amounts of power by focusing on individuals. Absent that kind of chat, we're far less likely to have the good kinds of ruling under our side of the house. But secondly, I think this makes it substantially easier to take away people's rights, because you divorce the questions of what people should do from the way that they impact other people. That means the kind of wide oppression like the Crusades is much more likely to happen. Proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition, deputy leader of opposition, and invite the member of government.
Okay, just want to check that I can be heard. Okay. Opening government gives you a long list of potential benefits with very little mechanisms for why people are more likely to do these things. In fact, the only analysis they give that's genuine is that you have greater self-motivation to do these things like give charities now. However, this is one symmetric on both sides. As Oo points out, you still feel like you have the obligations to do certain things in order to preserve people's rights, but the self-motivation seems to be similar. And secondly, is we think that in general, they don't explain what makes people likely to follow these moral codes, because they don't think people, in light of circumstances, instead of selfishness, automatically follow that which they're most self-intrinsically motivated to do. What we're going to tell you in extension is how enforcement of moral rules get much better on our side of the house. First extension for closing government, we get much better enforcement mechanisms. The first thing to notice is that rights violations are results-based. That is, if I believe I have a right to education, my right is violated at the point in which I have not received that education. Note that this is not then dependent on who has wronged me. Maybe the government gives poor education, but I receive good quality education from this great UN NGO down the street. In that way, my blame is never localized appropriately in actors who actually have failed, right? We think governments should provide education, but sometimes they haven't violated people's rights necessarily because other people step in. The second thing is there are lots of crimes with multiple, and in many cases, hundreds of millions of perpetrators. It makes it extremely difficult for you to pinpoint blame if you just make a rights claim. For example, let's take the example of government corruption. Corruption is the culminating effort of millions of or hundreds of thousands of officials, right, taking money, taking bribes out of the coffers, etc. Individually, if a corrupt official steals $1,000 from the treasury, he's not violating anyone's rights per se, because that $1,000 is not substantial enough to trigger some kind of rights harm. But collectively, among every single one of these individuals, you create a massive problem where there are no roads, there are very bad schools, etc. So the rights violation only happens with the culmination of these crimes, not at the individual level. So when you make arguments that is, we have our rights to have good governance is violated, you're not pinpointing at every single individual. This is also true for personal issues like climate change, where climate change is the culmination of everyone not turning off their lights when they leave the house, everyone littering, etc. You're not, so On their side of the house, they just know there is a problem. People's rights have been violated when there's corruption, but they don't tell you who is exactly responsible and how to fix it. On our side of the house, all of these thousands of officials have individually violated their duty, right? Which is to be honest, for example, where individual people have violated their duty to not litter or to turn off the lights. We have then the solvency. One, we are able to much better direct people's anger, both on an electoral level towards making the government fixes mistakes, but also in an impersonal, informal mechanism, where I am much likely to see just the fact that Jane littered, right, is the reason why I will socially sanction her informally. We think this outweighs a lot of the issues from OG, because we think this tackles the largest and most intractable issues, things that have thousands of victims, big issues like government corruption on the macro level, climate change, etc., that outweighs their, I think, rather small impacts from individual acts of charity. Second extension is that we think a moral system constructed around duties is easier to understand and upheld. It makes moral education easier. It makes it easier for people to try to be moral, and therefore makes enforcement better as well. The delta, we think, right, the comparative is duties tend to be more specific and have more details. You have a right to a good environment. You have a right to clean air. But there are thousands of things that contribute to an unclean environment and an unclean air. So in a comparative, you will have individual duties to turn the lights off, conserve energy, drive less if possible, right? Don't litter. These are the individual actions that tell you how to fulfill this, if you will, how to preserve that right, right? What is in the benefit of this? First, people find morality a lot more approachable, because if you just tell me you have to fix the problem, there are people's rights being violated on the other side of the world. These atrocious things are happening to them. That's a big issue I'm confronted with. I don't know what goes into it. I don't quite understand how to fix it. But having a duties-based moral system enables me to know exactly what are the individual steps I need to take to be a moral person in my own life. We think a huge problem in society, especially in daily life, is that of moral apathy, where I know that I am a morally imperfect person, but I don't bother to try to be a morally good person because it's simply too difficult. Where I don't understand how it is the case that I can, like so many people around the world can have like the right to education or not to be hungry to be fulfilled. So we think this is easier to teach and makes you do more actionable items on an individual level. So you make incremental progress, you don't just give up. The second thing is you actually have a very easy solution in these cases to your problems, right? Like if I know that this person's right to a good education is violated, I don't know exactly what's responsible for that or how to solve that. I feel like I'm being a bit repetitive, but I know that if someone failed their duty to say the government failed its duty to fund state-run primary schools, I know exactly what someone has to do to fix that problem. So we think there are a lot of cases in which I can have perverse actions to try to not violate someone's rights. For instance, if you believe that you have spouses have a right to not be cheated on by the other person, right? If I cheat on my spouse, I have not quite violated their rights at the point they don't know that I've cheated on it, because it's the point of it's a result-based system. So I can keep lying to them and try to obfuscate the fact. So it doesn't tell you exactly how to fix the problem of a rights violation. Sometimes you can do so in perverse ways. This is not true for duties, where if you fail your duty to not litter, you just don't litter, where you pick up the trash from the ground. So it's a lot more easily fixable. I'll take the POI from opening.
Rights usually specify a person that is obliged to fulfill the right. Like if I need food, it is obviously the government that's in charge. By contrast, it's far harder to figure out what should be done, which is a problem, because since obligations aren't results-based, now the government can say, we are trying, we have met our obligation, we just couldn't do it.
Okay, so one, right? Rights are also actions. So if you think that things are actionable, right? That is very easy. So the first response is, I think that, sorry, I've lost the strain of thought for POI. If it's really important, Jane will get to it. The last thing I want to talk about interacts with the material for opening opposition about the construction of rights and duties, because I think we both agree that human nature means I inherently sympathize more with people who look like me. I'm more likely to either define rights to include those who are of my race or of my gender, right? And same is true for duties. The reason OO thinks this is asymmetric is that, one, you're likely to want to include everyone to cover basic versions of rights, but that's not necessarily why that's the comparative. The POI I asked is, their argument is, men want rights too, so they find it convenient to invent an idea of universal human rights to include women so that vulnerable men can also be protected. But they don't explain why that's the likely alternative, as opposed to existing in a world in which privileged men refuse to believe there's concept of rights at all. So even vulnerable men don't get protected by the concept of rights. The reason why you get better extensions of duties towards groups who are more vulnerable is that duties are about they're a statement of the virtue and the character of the person who's doing the action. So it is oftentimes possible for you to show that you're extra virtuous by being charitable or by helping people who even you don't think is equal as you, right? So you're much more likely to feel like you have chivalric obligations to people who are inferior to you. You're not likely to do the same thing for rights. So we break that clash as well.
I thank the member of government and invite the member of opposition.
All right, just checking whether I'm audible. All right, cool. I'm actually gonna speak here. Stand. All right. Oh, sorry. I need a timer. It doesn't close, right? Starting in 3, 2, 1. What truly makes a moral system good? 1, a moral system that evolves with time. And 2, a moral system that safeguards itself from bad entities and power structures. Why is this true? Because moral systems usually fail when, for example, like in the case of religion, it doesn't keep up with the time, which means that your duty and allegiance to God is inflexible compared to your ability to give rights to LGBTQ people, women, etc. So it doesn't keep up with time. Or it is also true because oppressive systems have the power to pervert and indoctrinate you to believe in hatred within your moral system, like we have seen throughout generations. The reason why this framing is important, Pam, is because I think the opening half talks about static incentives and static instances, where OO says you're more likely to run away from duties and it is harder to infringe on people's rights. And OG says it is your duty to be proactive and it is easy to not extend rights to people by oppressors. The real debate is whether founding your moral systems on rights increases the propensity of it to grow while defending itself from power structures that flip-flop all throughout our lives. Like, I mean, like bad governments, bad religious leaders, good governments, good religious leaders have the ability to indoctrinate and change, like influence moral systems. And in different instances in time, like different things are effective, right? Like duties are sometimes more effective, rights are more effective. The deadlock breaker is, can rights be that foundational material in moral system that makes, like, again, evolving better and oppression more likely? So 2 arguments then. First, why rights allow for moral systems to evolve faster? Look, your ability to perceive rights to individuals are created from an increased understanding of cultures around you. You build tolerance to more and more people. Historically, we have seen this to be true because the more you get to know, the more access you have to information, the more likely it is that you empathize. So like throughout history, our empathy of individuals in different cultures have actually increased as opposed to decreased, which means our ability to then extend rights to people we now understand more has also increased with time. And this time sensitivity is important because our duties to other people, on the other hand, have not increased significantly well with time. The reason why this is true is because you may believe that people have the right to access something, but we are not wired to believe that we are the ones who have the duty to give it to them, right? Because that's how politics and everything works. So the comparative is, under your world, under Gov's world, moral systems get stuck in time because duties don't evolve as quickly as our understanding and empathy of individuals and our ability to give rights to them. For all the I think O talked about the logistics and escapism of this. But the reason why this comparative is crucial, panel, is because if this is again a prefers motion, right, which also necessitates, right, or this also necessitates that in a world in which moral systems are founded by this, the propensity through which moral systems would have evolved and become more inclusive is literally more on rights than it is on duties. The reason why you still should advocate for this, even if you think it's a wash, is because at least under our world, you can still advocate for moral rights, even if you don't want to do anything about it. And that is important, panel. And I know it makes you a shit human being that you think people have rights, but you don't take action on it. But I think it still makes you filter and hold institutions accountable, because it is valuable to recognize rights that people have, even if you or your government are not the ones that can give it to them in all of these sorts of circumstances, because the acknowledgement of rights and acknowledgements of morality through rights in and of itself means that you give agency to individuals regardless of whether or not it can be accessed. And this directly engages with CG's analysis of why rights are result cumulative. It is not result cumulative, it is based on understanding, and that is uniquely gotten under our world. Second argument, why it protects from oppressive governments and religious leaders. This is incredibly crucial, panel, because again, if the opening of deadlock rests on something, it's this. Because look, we agree oppressive governments are self-centered and have a superiority complex, and that is what they use to harm people. The comparison here is simple, panel. The moral system stands as a filter between you and the institutions that tell you to do things, right? It is significantly harder for an institution or government or religious leader to ask you to violate rights than it is for them to ask you to not extend duties. Why is this true? Because one, I think people are naturally more empathetic because of the time analysis I gave you towards people, even if they have differences. Look, panel, if you think that people are biased towards people that look like them, it is easier still then, but before I move on, anything from like OG, if not CG.
Yeah, this argument.
Out of order. Sorry, right at the border.
I'm sorry. Look, it is significantly easier for you to ask someone to not extend their duties as an oppressive government than it is to ask people to indoctrinate individuals. Because even when differences exist, even if I concede that you're more biased to people around you, just because you're more biased to people around you doesn't mean you believe in the violation of rights of people that don't look like you. It is harder to do that logical connection, panel, comparison to duties. Because again, it is easier to extend duties to people that are nearer to you than people that are farther to you. But again, even when differences exist, it is still easier for you to be empathetic about people that don't look like you, people that don't speak your language, and believe that they need to advocate for beauty. The comparison, panel, is the threshold of hate mongering that needs to occur to corrupt a moral system that is built on rights. The threshold of hate mongering is so high that it's like moral systems that are based on rights stand the test of time. Whereas moral systems that are, again, contingent upon duties are easily manipulated because of convenience and things of that sort. This debate has to be one on what moral systems evolve with time and what moral systems protect themselves from oppression. We show you both.
I think that's speaker and invite the government.
Okay, awesome. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I will take POIs if you want to turn on your camera and wave. And if I don't take one by 5:30, please interrupt me, or I might just forget to take you, and that's, sad for all of us. So. Three, two, one. I'm going to start by responding to what OO says. I actually agree with the first 3 minutes of framing out of LO. The emphasis is on the person doing the action rather than the victim. Why does this follow that we think it is much, much better? OO says a few things. First, they say things like duty develops proximately and it's easier to follow. The problem is we already have things like altruism, like a desire to be socially liked, like the fact that we don't enjoy people seeming sad when we hurt them, that when there is a clear victim, we are already and we can very clearly see the impact. they're very much likely to not want to violate their rights or fulfill our duties in either world. The question is, it is much more important, therefore, to do it when we do not have a clear victim, which is say there's evolutionary reasons for kindness, but I don't know if the reason that you need duty, so it's more likely that you're going to be kind to people where there are clear victims in either world, absent moral reasoning. The idea is you need moral reasoning when it is a case where you wouldn't do it out of self-interest because you enjoy seeing other people happy. Moreover, given that we don't seem to care about the rights of people far away, I'm not sure what the important difference is, which is say people have a right not to be killed. I still do jack shit because they're very, very far away and I don't see the victim. I don't hear their voice because they're far away from me. That is when a duty is much more beneficial. That is when you need to do these types of things because moral reasoning is the most important when you wouldn't do it for other reasons, but we already care about victims for other reasons like altruism, like wanting the success of our species, like not wanting to see it seem like a dick if someone is like drowning, etc. They say that it is easier to argue that you don't have a duty than someone else doesn't have a right. The problem is a lot of racism was based on the idea that people are subhuman and therefore don't have rights. I don't think saying people will see how similar they are happens. I think you just emphasize differences between people. I think this is especially true with things like gender, where there are actually differences. But the thing is, if people think you are human and therefore you have a duty generally, you do say I have a duty not to hit people. Even if I don't think a person is human and therefore doesn't have human rights, I still have a duty. I think this is especially true with regards to women. Men often believe that they had duties towards their wives or being chivalrous to women because they were good men rather than because the women had rights. I think it's really hard to get rights if you are not seen as human, but we do have duties to non-humans. I don't hit animals because I just don't hit anything, even if I don't think they have human rights, because I still have that empathy. We also think people like hitting walls is kind of bad. Finally, what does Greg say? Greg says you're going to bully people into doing bad things like dying in the Crusades. If people are selfish, then probably rights and duties tend to develop similarly. The question is, do you apply your duty that you develop in interpersonal situations to situations that are not interpersonal? E.g., you can have a right not to be free from theft, and I can have a duty not to steal. The question is, do you have a duty not to steal even when someone doesn't have a right not to theft? This is the example Dan gives with corruption in government, which is to say the money has already been taken to people. So maybe there's no real right to government efficiency. So it doesn't really matter. You have no right for that money not to be taken and used however the government pleases. But people can still have duties not to steal, which they will develop for interpersonal reasons. But they then apply those duties in situations where no one's right is being violated because the money has already been taken for government. So I don't think anyone actually has a right that is being violated in that situation. Finally, I'm going to respond to the POI that Dan did not respond to. Which is say one, they say you have rights already give obligations to a specific actor. Notably, the CAs did not say this. They said it's up for debate. But two, I don't think rights are indicated by a specific actor. Rights are very victim-centric, which you say. The entire emphasis is on the person being violated, not the person who's doing the violation. So I think their own framing removes this. But notably, besides government, maybe, it's pretty unclear who to blame in most situations for your rights being violated. For example, your right to clean air, which is maybe you blame factories, but you could also blame the government for not providing regulation. Maybe you should blame the government not for not regulating, but for instead not implementing technology that cleans the air. It's very unclear who is actually to blame because a lot of people are responsible for it. So I don't think that matters. Moreover, all of this only matters if the right is not fulfilled, which is what Dan tells you, which is to say someone may be failing in their duty to you, e.g. governments ought to provide education, but no one's rights are being violated if an NGO steps in. But this is bad for the long term because it usually leads to less good consequences and governments are just worse and charities can't last forever. Now I'm going to do some responses to what CO says. They basically say duties are outdated. You have religious duties that don't update. Here's the problem. Rights also have these issues. We said only men had rights, biblically ordained rights can exist. But moreover, duties update because there are more clear instructions. The right to clean air existed for 150 years, but we have different duties to respond because of different technology like electricity. It's much easier to update things that are instructions, whereas rights will always lag behind technological innovation, which is to say you don't update what a person has to do to be moral when we have technology that develops. Second, they say rights lead to more tolerance. I think it is better if we extend duties to people even prior to the idea that they have rights, which is to say, even when you don't see them as human, you still have to extend a duty to them. And that's much better. Violations of duty exist even when people don't have empathy, whereas the existence of rights only occurs when people believe they are similar enough that the person also has rights. And I think that's important. Finally, they say that the CO's second extension seems to be it's easier to ask people not to do a duty than to violate a right. But like, there's no justification. Presumably in our world, duties are seen as equally sacred to rights. It's like the reason you may think rights are more like not able to be violated is because you live in a world that strongly believes in rights as opposed to doesn't have a strong belief in duties. Why do I think, sorry, I will take a PO from OO if they have one.
So in the few cases where rights need to be met by the actions of lots of people without an obvious responsible party, it's not clear why the system of morality would encode those duties, especially as we argue it's less likely over time as people have the freedom to ignore these obligations, and also because there's less obligation, there's less receptivity to the imposition of these obligations.
I don't think that happens because I think people still come up with the same concepts, which is to say they might be developed interpersonally and applied globally. E.g., the example about corruption, which is I developed the duty not to steal because we want to live in a world where people don't steal from each other. That's a much better system. If for the same reason we developed the right not to steal. The question is, do you apply it in other circumstances? Same with the issue of pollution, which is to say, if we think there is a right to clean air, we're probably likely to develop a duty not to pollute because people don't want to live in a polluted world. Even if the company doesn't believe they have this duty, other people can hold them accountable for like violating the duty to give them clean air. So I think you're likely to get the development on either side. First of all, like what is like I think OG says. I think the frame why OG is out of the round is I think people are selfish on both sides, which OO like says people are lazy, rude, and tired and don't want to fulfill their duties. We tell you why the difference is people demand duties from others rather than rights. And I think this leads to development of better moral reasoning. What do we say? One, we say you're going to stop things like victimless crime. And you're less likely to only do actions if you see an identifiable victim, which means you're more likely to help people who you don't know personally, who aren't of your ethnic group, who you don't see in everyday life. Finally, Dan tells you why it's much easier to uphold and make moral education better because you know what steps to take. Much easier to be a moral person. And therefore, more people do it. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
I thank that speaker and invite the op-rep to close out the round.
Am I audible? All right. POI is in chat, obviously. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to break the top half deadlock and tell you why Sriyan's analysis is the most important analysis in the round, insofar as it doesn't rely on like one single instance or example on which like someone's right or duty applies more or more importantly. Secondly, to talk to you about why CG is just largely one, derivative, and two, just out of the round. And then finally, some more like weighing as to why I think, regardless of whether or not you accept like whether duties come first or rights come first, or whether rights are what create duties, like our analysis kind of sidesteps all of that and explains to you like why our moral system is just better because of like it's less like it because it resists like co-optation and also like doesn't really rely on like individuals being socialized to agree with certain things or other things. All right, top half deadlock first. And the reason why this is important is because I think it sets up like all the confusion in the debate. OG tells us that people have a proactive duty to fight for climate justice, racial justice, economic justice. Conversely, OO tells us that people will prioritize different types of duties based on like their individual like prioritizations. Like you might prioritize your family or your local community or even just yourself. I think all this exchange explains is that moral systems are largely like arbitrary. They change based on individuals and I also change based on circumstance. I think this is where my POI about the active shooter system becomes important, is to say that like someone's duty changes based on their capacity to perform that duty. And I think this is largely the biggest problem for government bench, right? Is that duties are things that are flexible, right? Duties are things that change based on whether or not I can perceive myself to perform that duty or whether I'm socialized to consider that to be an important thing that I should do, right? This is to say that like I can justify destructive things like war because I believe that people don't deserve rights and therefore should be invaded, or just as easy as I can say, hey, it's my duty to my country to protect myself by preemptively invading this other country, right? The only way to resolve this, therefore, is to understand one, that like those types of large-scale macro oppressions and aggressions are largely symmetric on both sides of the house and probably easily justifiable by systems of power. But it's to analyze what moral system is less co-optable to that kind of perversion. I think in this respect, Sriyan gives you 2 important points. One, rights just become more effective as we learn more about the world and its complexities and nuances. That's to say that in an increasingly globalizing world, in a world in which you have increasing access to things like information, you just like rights are more likely to grow with that information, are more likely to grow with like our just advancement as people and societies. But secondly, the duties remain static, i.e. like our growing empathy for people, or like just the knowledge about what's happening in like sweatshops in Bangladesh, for instance, don't necessarily necessitate action on our part. CG responds to this by saying, well, duties can be updated, rights can't. I think the opposite is true, right? Duties often tend to be localized and limited by your capacity to perform them, whereas rights are universal. That necessarily means that rights create a framework through which other moral actions can be generated and therefore can evolve in societies in ways that duties can't. That's to say that like the creation of the internet, we largely base the ways in which we interact, or like the rights we get in the internet space, based on existing rights that have been established in the like before us, right? So that's to say that like my right to protection protects me from things like cyberbullying. My right to privacy gives me things like access to like, you know, user generated passwords and things like that that protect my information from being stolen, or like create like contracts that force like corporations to tell me that I'm being like that my information is being taken before I accept like the access to a website or whatever, right? So the point is to say that like rights create frameworks. Duties, on the other hand, have to be like created. Like duties have to be like generated specifically towards certain situations, right? So in an active shooter scenario, right, like my right to life is the thing that's important, right? It's not whether or not I have a duty to step in and like to make that moral calculus myself and step in and say whether or not I should or should not like try and influence this situation. And in fact, I would say oftentimes it's exactly in those situations that you often get things like destructive things like vigilantism, or like the types of mistakes that are largely likely to make situations worse on your side of the house. So I think that largely contends to why the upper half deadlock is better explained by us, because I think what we show you is that like regardless of like whether or not those moral systems can be perverted, one just grows with time and is therefore more applicable. I think just on a scale impact, that means that like at least if you had to choose why you choose rights over duties, it's because rights can evolve with time. This is an impact that is separate from like all the other analysis about oppression and stuff, because it just shows you that the moral system based on rights is one that evolves with time, and therefore one that's likely to remain and stay robust. I think this is also largely like why you've seen such a universalization of rights discourse as like the primary form of morality that most people generate. Like I think this is why like people in Hong Kong and Cuba talk not about the duty that the West has to protect them or protect their democratic rights, but they specifically use rights-based discourse as a way to appeal to empathy, appeal to emotion, and say, hey, our rights are being violated. This is a way in which like now we need to hold these regimes accountable. This brings me on to CG then. CG gives us basically the same argument, but explained in 2 different examples. The first example is, hey, if you have a duty-based morality system, actually, before I go on, I'll take OG. Nothing, CG?
The same incentives to make rights not based on ability, which is you want moral certainty, which mean our world evolves duties not contingent on ability. For example, the duty absolutely to not kill.
Okay, so first of all, your duty to not kill is based on the right that the other person has to life, right? Secondly, the point I'm trying to make is that like in your world, your duty to kill can be changed based on like the situation at hand, whereas like the right to life is something that that person whose right is being violated, or like the person that they know, whatever, like can advocate for, that's like separate from whether or not you feel you have a duty to do that thing or not do that thing. All right, look, CG loses. Look, CG tells us 1, you feel guilty if you're practicing corruption, or secondly, that like you don't have a duty to admit that you've cheated on your partner, because if your partner's rights are only hurt at the point at which they know their right has been violated, right? I think there's a couple of responses to this. One is to say that depends largely on like if you feel guilt at all, right? Like in a world in which like I am someone that's engaging in embezzlement or corruption, if I don't feel guilty about that, right? Like the rights, like it depends on me being socialized to believe I have that duty in the first place. Oftentimes, like people don't necessarily feel that they have that duty, right? Like oftentimes people feel like it's okay for me to violate like this person's trust because like I just haven't been raised that way. Like you never proved me why you create the link word that's to say that like everyone will follow your specific form of morality, or like some like objective form of like deontological morality that's like been handed down to you from like God or something. But secondly, when people know their rights have been violated, they're probably more likely to advocate for them, right? That you get better like social organization on our side of the house, at the point in which like if 100 people know that they've lost out because one corrupt person took $1,000, it means that those 100 people now have a claim to say, hey, you should be tried for what you did, as opposed to a world in which that duty relies on the person themselves feeling guilty and wanting to step forward. I think on those grounds, proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker and all speakers for an excellent round. Also, I think in the hubbub of the opening judge swap, I forgot to do the requisite but very deserved congratulations to everyone on making it to the quarterfinals of the Yale online fall IV, or maybe fall online IV. I don't know what we're officially calling it, but it's some combination of those 4 words.